I just want to thank you for allowing me some time on the platform. And I want to put this into some sort of context for you. About 5 years ago, we went to see a prospective client who said that they were interested in upskilling their significant sales team. It wasn't an ad business, but they were interested in upskilling their significant sales team in this art or science of negotiation. And we arrived at the meeting, and the client came down to meet me in reception and apologized and said that she was terribly sorry, but they were going to postpone the meeting because they'd made a slightly different decision. And I said, obviously, what was that decision? She said, well, we've decided that actually the problem we have is that the people we have are not good enough negotiators. They're not getting the right sort of deals. So we're going to get rid of a significant proportion of the sales force and replace them with new ones. And the obvious question I asked was, well, what will be different about the new people versus the people you're getting rid of? What will be the competencies? What will be the skills that they have that are not replicated in the ones that you're going to get rid of in the first place? And she said, well, I don't really know. And I thought that was really interesting, because I think that's one of the big challenges we have is, well, what does a good negotiator look like? And we took some time about 5 years ago to start develop what we would describe as a competency framework that started to identify what performance looked like, to echo back to what Keith was saying, what good performance looked like throughout the negotiation process. And we've been doing that now for a number of clients over a number of years, trying to identify what good looks like. And we had a conversation with Tom Lewis about a year ago now, talking about doing this on a more industry-specific basis. And we have run a capability report, a negotiation capability report, amongst the IPA members. And I'm delighted to say we got a significant amount of results from that. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the key things that we found out. But before I do that, I want you to imagine this situation. You get an email or a call from a client. The client says, good news, we really like the solution that you presented to us. I'd like you to come and meet me tomorrow with your team. And I'd like to talk to you about the commercial proposal that you made, because we're really not very happy with that. We like the ideas, but we're not very happy with the terms under which those ideas will be delivered. Now imagine you have the evening to think about how you're going to handle the meeting the next day. What are you going to do? You're going to sit there and watch Love Island. It's great, by the way. You're going to sit there and watch Love Island and hope that it all goes well. Or are you going to think about, well, what do we do if they say no to our proposal? Where do we have flexibility? How can we introduce that flexibility? If they've got a problem in one area, what do we do? What's my team going to do? What might they do? All of those sort of questions, a bit like a pilot, for my friend Tom Kinnard here will know this, a pilot will have a checklist of the things that they're going to be thinking about before they take off. What's your checklist look like? And I think there is a problem here, and again, this was emphasized by a number of the speakers, is that for some reason, and this came out from the survey that we did, there is a real fear of conflict. And conflict, I'm afraid, is the water in the pool. Conflict is inevitable. If you're buying stuff, imagine you're going to buy a car. When you're going to buy the car, you're going to look for a better price. You're going to look for more value by having all the extras included. You're going to look to reduce the risk by ensuring that they service it for 3, 4, 5 years. And you're going to try and defer the payment by asking for interest-free credit. So when you're buying, you're doing all of that kind of stuff. When you're selling, you're obviously doing the exact opposite. You want a higher price. You want your value to be recognized. You want better payment terms, and you want to pass the risk back to them. So the inevitability of conflict is there, but sometimes or somehow we just don't seem to accept it. And I think this is the ultimate dilemma we face. Do I say no? Do I, in my view, or your view potentially, do I risk the relationship by saying no? Or do I give in? My slides are not very good for it. It should say had to keep the client sweet. Anybody ever said that? Anybody ever said we had to concede because we had to keep the client sweet? Well, I think there's another way we can deal with this, and that other third way is to negotiate. Now, in order to negotiate, we have to do a lot of things, and we have to have a lot of capabilities and competencies that drive those things. And I want to pick up on a couple of those things throughout the rest of this speech. For me, and I work for a company called Scotwork, a little plug there. For me, I work for this organization that defines negotiation as this. It is a process, a defined, identifiable process. There are rules to this game. There's a way of understanding the map of what goes on in a negotiation. It's a process by which parties in conflict's kind of inevitable, trade issues of lesser importance in exchange for issues of greater importance. So the essence of negotiation is it requires conflict. There's always one there, but it also requires trading. And I think that's one of the interesting things that people struggle with when we train them in negotiation skills. This is kind of how it used to look. We'd get a pitch from a client, we'd get a request from a client, and we'd think, well, we'd be looking for a fee around here. The client are probably sitting in their offices and thinking, well, this is the work we need doing. We'd like to pay, I lied here, we'd like to pay this. You think, well, that's what we'd like, but based on the market conditions, based on what we know our competitors would charge, we've got flexibility away from that ideal. But it's only to a certain point, which we would describe as a limit position. I can assure you the client will be doing the same thing. They'll be thinking, well, that's what we'd like ideally to pay, but we recognize we're probably not going to get away with that, and recognize this is a one-dimensional haggle rather than a negotiation. But if there is a degree of overlap between those two things, we would call that the bargaining arena. Harvard call it the zone of possible agreement. There are lots of different names for it. But the really interesting thing about that is a deal is possible anywhere within that area. It's not about power anymore. Both parties have exactly the same power. It's about the skills that you use to strike a deal at your end rather than at their end of the bargaining arena. Does that kind of make sense? Now, I was talking about this with an agency principal a couple of years ago, and he said, Alan, you've been out of the game for too long. It doesn't look like that anymore. The reality is this. We have an ideal, and the client has a demand. And they repeat that demand regularly. So we think, well, that's our ideal, but we do have some flexibility, but it's no, that's it. That's as far as we can go. That's our limit position. Beyond that, we're in problems. And the client repeats their demand. So we go back to the office, and we think, well, this is an important client. We really need to keep them. They're good for the business, allows recovery, overhead recovery. So we'll give a bit more flexibility on it, and we'll drop down a little bit further. The client says, you're not listening, are you? And repeat their demand. And you then effectively capitulate.
We want this and that. We demand a share in that and most of that, some of this and all of that. Less of that and more of this and plenty of this. Another thing, we want it now. I want it yesterday. I want more tomorrow. And the demands will all be changed then, so stay awake.
And I think this is one of the essence of negotiation, or it's not a negotiation, it's actually conceding. We're conceding, we're giving in slowly. And actually, I think we haven't really spent time, well, whilst this is going on, by the way, of course, what's happening to your profitability? And I think, and we train both sides of the fence. We train salespeople and procurement people. And procurement say, good grief, procurement say that they don't get pushback from agencies very much. In fact, they like dealing with agencies because it seems to them to be a fairly easy negotiation to have. Now, you're going to say, yeah, that's all very well, but that's one variable. Negotiations have lots of different variables involved. They'll have scope, they'll have price, they'll have value. There'll be lots of different variables. But provided there is a degree of overlap, there is an opportunity to negotiate. And even if there is no overlap, perhaps I can change the value in one variable to give me more value in another area that allows me to be able to do a deal. Now, we think that if you're negotiating, you're going to be doing one of 8 things. We call that the 8-step process. Scotwork didn't invent negotiating. We simply watched what people did when they were negotiating and badged the process. Now, if you understand the rules of the game, We think it allows you to be far more effective in being able to manage that process to your benefit. We prepare to negotiate. We have a dialogue, which we class as the argue step. We may send signals or receive signals of flexibility. Proposals will be made. They'll be rejected because they're either not the right shape, we need to repackage them, or there's not enough, in which case we need to add more into them. We'll close and we'll agree. That's what's happening when we're negotiating. But a recognition of that is pretty critical to understand what the rules of the game look like. Now, there were 4 things that to me really stood out from the survey. There were 75 data points, so there's lots of other stuff, but there were 4 things that I think really stood out with regard to the survey we ran with you. The first one was this. It seems to me that we are remarkably unprepared for the negotiations we get involved in. 41% of the survey said they didn't have enough time to prepare effectively for the negotiations they were going to get involved in. We've been doing a few polls. Who spends a lot of time preparing their pitches, if they're pitching, the creative work, rehearsing the pitches, et cetera, before they're going to see a client? Who spends a lot of time doing that? Show of hands. Who spends a lot of time and gives it the commercial importance that it has in rehearsing, planning, preparing for the negotiations you're going to have with the clients? Gosh. Not very many. My point here is that we don't spend very much time preparing for these things. The time that you do spend preparing for them tends to be in amassing lots of arguments to convince the other side to see it your way, a bit like the Jedi mind trick that was mentioned before. You know, if I say it like this, they're going to say, yes, that's not the discount we're looking for. You know, it just doesn't work. 41% of people say they haven't got enough time, and what time they do spend is not a good use of it. Only 12% said if the negotiation started to go wrong, they didn't have a fallback position. They didn't know what to do next. And that's a challenge in itself. And 27% said that the business supported the negotiations, so they had processes in place, they had people who could help through the negotiation process to have some sort of corporate responsibility about how that business negotiates, which meant that the rest of them were going it alone. I think that is, again, a challenge. And it's a challenge for the businesses as well as the individual. I am conscious that I'm very tight on time, but I do think I'm going to give you a couple of snippets to take away. One of which is this. I'm going to take you through a negotiation, potential negotiation, or one I actually had in my personal life. Negotiation is a life skill, by the way, not just a commercial skill. A negotiation I had a number of years ago when it was my wife and I's 25th wedding anniversary. And we decided to go out to celebrate 25 years of wedded bliss by having a nice meal together. The issues I'm going to put up were these. The first was the date. Our wedding anniversary happened to fall on a Saturday. 25 years previous, we'd got married. It'd be great to go out on that date. The location was Le Manoir or Quatre Saisons. Anybody been there? Fabulous restaurant. Oh, I think agency margins are still pretty good then. The time, I'm a Northern European. I like to eat relatively early. 7:30 is my preferred time. And the table for 2. So before I begin any potential negotiation, I think about what are the issues and what is this negotiation potentially going to involve, and what is my intent to get position? What am I going to ask for? The next thing I want to think about is what's my must-achieve position? The date for me is not a must-achieve. For someone who's very romantic, it might be, but not for me. The location is a must-achieve. If I can't get there, we'll do something completely different. I'll cook a nice meal at home. 7:30 is my preferred time, but I have a little bit of flexibility, provided it's no later than 9 p.m. Table for 2. Look, we've been married for 25 years. If we get a table for 4, it'll give us someone to talk to. My point is, before I go into any negotiation, I'm thinking about the issues, what's my intent to get, what's my limit position look like. That's not too difficult, is it really? The difficult thing is to think about, well, if I'm forced to move away from my intend to get position, if something happens that means I have to move away from that, how do I do it? By negotiating and not just giving in. And that third set of objectives that I would set myself is what I would describe as a wish list. Now, the wish lists are the nice things to have in the deal. Think about the things that the clients ask you to give to them that are not necessarily integral to the deal, but nice to haves. Now, in this situation, there could be things like this: a limousine to take me home, the chef to greet us in person when we arrive, cocktails, celebrity table, all kinds of creative things that I can add into my planning. How am I going to use this wish list? I call the restaurant and I say I'm looking for a table for 2, 7:30, Saturday, the 25th of May. And the maitre d' says, yep, that's fine. In fact, we're fairly quiet that evening. What am I thinking? I haven't asked for enough. Client rings you up and says, we're looking for this from you. And you say, yeah, that's absolutely fine. We'd love to do that. What's the client thinking? The procurement department? Haven't asked for enough. Tell you what, if you give me the celebrity table and get the chef to greet us when we arrive, then I'm prepared to confirm my booking. A wish list allows me to put a turn on a deal when I recognize there's more value. Procurement are very good at this. I arrive. The maitre d' says, I'm sorry, somebody's lingering over their coffee, so your table's not going to be ready now until 8:30. I could, of course, do the typical British thing and say, that'll be fine. I'll sit in the car and wait. Or, of course, I recognize that I'm being asked to move away from my intent to get position, and I will only do so by trading. If you give me a limousine home and some free wine while I'm waiting, then I'm prepared to wait until 8:30. A wish list allows you to do two things. It allows you to put a turn on a deal when you recognize there's more value, but critically, it also allows you to manage or negotiate any movement you make away from your intent to get position. If you've got a defined intent to get position and you haven't achieved it, one of the things your businesses should be saying is to the people that are doing the negotiation, you didn't achieve what we agreed. What did you get back for the movement that we made? And if they say nothing, they haven't been negotiating. A couple of other things. One, there seemed to us to be a fairly weak understanding of the concept of trading. What do I mean by that? Only 22% of the survey said that they always consider the difference between cost and value. I think that's quite interesting. 54% said when they'd made a position, they stuck to it. They didn't have concessions that they may be able to introduce that helps move the negotiation forward. And only 6% said that they felt that they could make tactically adept counter-proposals to respond to the other side. I want to just drill down on one thing. I want you to be thinking about this when you're thinking about the variables that are involved in the negotiations you get involved in. What is the cost? How much does this variable cost? And what is the value? And if I'm thinking of things that have differential commercial value, I think that's good news. Because if I can find things that have a low cost and a high value, i.e. they sit above that line, they become value enhancing in the negotiation. If negotiating is about two things, which I think it is, it's about value sharing and value creation. If we can create value by finding things that sit above this line here, then I think that becomes a very useful thing to be using in the negotiations we get involved in. That's where I'm looking. That's where I'm looking to. Things that cost the agency less to give than the client values it at. And I don't think we spend enough time, clearly, as evidenced by the report, that happens. I'm conscious. Agencies don't like conflict. I don't think that's a big surprise. 89% of the people on my survey said that they would make concessions to breed goodwill. I have to tell you, when you're making concessions, it doesn't necessarily breed goodwill. It potentially breeds greed. If you're giving things away, the procurement department particularly will be very happy to receive anything you're going to give them. Only 56% said if the client made an outrageous demand, something very ambitious, would they know how to deal with it? And I think clients are starting to do much more of that in the commercial world that we live in. And 85% would do anything that they could to protect the relationship. got to cut it. It's a great story. You're going to have to come on the course to listen to that story. That's the trade. You come on the course, I'll tell you the story. The other thing is people say they see negotiating as relationship damaging. Only 10% said that the negotiations they got involved in built value for their agency. Only 20% said that the negotiations they got involved in built the long-term relationship. Now, bearing in mind we're making lots of concessions to protect it, it isn't working very well, is it? And 59% said that when they got to the end game and the clients asked for a few more things, they would give in. That's where you potentially very dangerously give away a lot of value in the deal. Look, a few things that have come out. There's lots of other material, and we'll be writing some other reports. Within this survey, we were looking at the difference between males and females, whether they negotiated differently. The headline is they don't, so that's quite interesting. But the conclusions were, from my little talk here, is look, conflict's inevitable. You need to think about this in terms of the process that you're going to instigate in the business and in your personal attitude to negotiation. And it's a mindset change. You can improve your skills, you can improve your performance by looking at the competencies that people have within these 8 steps that we talk about. Final point to leave you with, and it wasn't written by a Scott worker, it's written by one of our competitors, but I've stolen it because I think it's a great phrase. We don't always get what we deserve, we get what we negotiate. Go back and negotiate. Thank you.